as we look at this here this evening, these are some of the things here that I told you we'd look through this kind of in segments. We all kind of know the story of the Exodus. We're not really going to get into that. We want to look at this particular part, but Pharaoh, the caption here in my Bible says Pharaoh pursues the Israelites, and this is all because God said this is what was going to happen. But I want you to understand some things as we begin to look at this. Not everybody at this time was willing to follow the Lord. Not everybody here was still 100% sold upon God's salvation, upon His deliverance, upon His might, upon His strength. Not everybody was on board at this point. Not everybody was of one mind, and not everybody was of one accord. Not only was there the Israelites that was there, but there was also, if you begin to read and study these things, there was a mixed multitude that was there. You had saved, you had lost, if you will. There was the Israelites, there was the other nations, and that's why I'm saying saved and lost. I don't mean it that way per se, but it's easier for us to understand in the latter part of this. But I want you to understand that there was that mixed multitude, but I want you also to keep this in mind, that this was God's plan. This was God's plan that the entire time here. God always had His hand upon them. But it says, and it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled. Now going back to the 10 plagues, and then God really dealing with Pharaoh, saying, hey, let my people go. But God said, I will harden his heart. But anyways, the people began to cry out, why did you let them go? You know, because the Egyptians up to this point, if you kind of get into the history portion of this and you really begin to study that civilization, the Egyptians were masters at getting a lot done and never lifting a finger. The Egyptians were great at building things through slave labor. The Egyptians was probably some of the most pampered people that you could imagine. Everyone else done their work for them. Understand that. So when you have this great number, okay, understand that this great number of slaves, this great multitude, this was a nation of people that is leaving. You're going to have a lot of people thinking, well, you know, we're going to have to work now. You know, these things are going to have to begin to happen. The people begin to complain. Okay, now this was the opposite side of the people, but people was beginning to complain that God was working. Amen? Understand and stay with me here. So Pharaoh thought, well, I'll just please the people. And it said he made ready his chariot. This was his chariot and his guard. And then he took 600 chosen chariots, and this would have been probably the best of his special forces, if you will, the 600 that he chose. And then it said all the chariots of Egypt. So this was, I guess, the rest of the regular army here. And the captains over every one of them. So I want you to understand that this nation of people finally got the deliverance that they desired from God, that they went out, but they were still complaining because they was afraid to go out in the wilderness. They was afraid of the unknown. They was more content setting with what they did know. We'll get to the point shortly. But these people, if you go back to the beginning of this, now Moses knew that he was going to be leading them into a spot where they was going to be surrounded kind of and nowhere to go. That was a divine plan. I want us to understand that sometimes God leads us into a spot where we feel entrapped. That we feel as though there's no way out. That we begin to question God's authority. We begin to question His might, just as His people did. I want you to understand here tonight that His people that had seen all the plagues that He had done, all the things that He had done to smite the Egyptians, all these things, these people were witnesses of this, yet they were still afraid to follow Him. And when they did step out on that faith to follow Him, they still questioned His might. You're not alone in doing so. You're not the first person to do it. It was done long ago in Exodus. Following God is scary because sometimes God will lead you into a spot where you are surrounded. He will lead you to a spot where there's no way out, so He can provide the way out so you can see His might and His power and His deliverance. Understanding all these things, this is what happened. They could hear imagine the chariots now. The Egyptian chariots were different, maybe so, than the Romans, because the Romans had much bigger horses. They had a lot bigger horses. They had a little bit heavier chariots, if you will, but the Egyptian chariots were somewhat smaller. Their rails was usually no more than 2 foot high, so their rails really didn't come up much more than the thighs of the men, but their horses were smaller, so there was two horses per chariot. Okay, with that being said, there were 600 of the chosen. These were the best of the best. So that is now 1,200 horses that are there. If we're going to do math, and this was all the rest of them, so we know there were at least 1,200. Now imagine 1,200 horses running towards something. You can feel that and you can hear it. Now we have a better picture of what the children of Israel, and when we think of the children of Israel, I don't want you to think of a handful of 50 to 100 people. You're looking at a nation that is here. There is tons of people that is here. And these people, they begin to hear these things, and you got to also understand that not everybody was willing to go. Poor Moses. Man, the preachers, pastors will complain of leading congregations as small as 20 to as large as, up into the hundreds. Moses had a nation. And these people, it wasn't like our politicians today that claim that they hear our voice. Moses didn't have no choice. He could hear it. He was there. He didn't have the secret service. Amen. He had God's protection. But understand, these people began to complain, and they said, "You have done this to us. Why would you do this? Why would you lead us to our death? We was perfectly content staying with our known realm. We enjoyed what we knew. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't the best circumstances, but we knew. We knew what it was." So the people are now in a turmoil. Because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Why would you do this, Moses? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt? They're now saying, we told you this was going to happen. And poor Moses, he says, "Fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today." How oftentimes is it, now get back to me with the kind of the message that we have for this evening. How many times is it that whenever we follow God's lead and we step out on that step of faith, and we're standing there, and all of a sudden things begin to look really shaky. We can begin to hear the riders coming, if you will, the chariots that are coming toward us, this massive army, these whatever it is that we feel that we can't defeat. There's no way to escape this side, there's no way to escape over here, and there's no way to escape behind us, and there's all this great terrifying army that is coming towards you. Imagine that feeling of desperation. You don't have to imagine it, you've been there. Guarantee it. You don't know which way to turn, you don't know what to do. You begin to think, Lord, I really feel as though you was calling me to do this. I really feel as though I was led. And all of a sudden, maybe I was wrong. I begin to second guess what God has provided for me. I begin to second guess what it is that God's plans in my life, and all these things that I never once begin to think, how is God going to deliver me? Because all I can see is the destruction. My faith is not in God at that point. I'm in the bonds of fear. Fear ye not, and stand still. I've really attempted to paint this beautiful picture for you, of that feeling that they would have, that feeling of desperation, of the mountain over here, the sea, and then another mountain, and all these riders coming, and that thundering of their hooves. I want you to understand that you would be able to feel that upon the earth. You could feel the vibration that would be there of these riders thundering in your direction. You could hear this for miles. This wasn't exactly lush green country either. You would have been able to see the dust that would have been around them. I need you to understand all these things to truly be able to feel the desperation. Panic. You ever been there? Amen. Let's get off our high and mighty horses here. Let's get on the little short horses that the Egyptians had that's a little bit closer to the ground, and let's all become humble and say, yes, preacher, I've been there. I have doubted the Lord. I have stepped out on faith and then begin to fear what man can do to me. I've begun to fear that maybe the devil has got inside my mind and led me astray and all these different things. I have truly feared. I have not looked at the salvation of God. But this is exactly why this was a divine plan of the Lord's. And I want you to understand that sometimes your feelings of desperation is by divine design so you can see God. Fear ye not, and stand still. If you were in their shoes, could you stand still? Imagine you having your family, and this thundering noise coming towards you, sense of desperation kicks in. You can't go anywhere. What's the least that you can do? You can begin to look and find a cover that is immediately around you. You're screaming out in desperation. Nobody seems to hear you. Your fearless leader is, at this point, you think is just ignorant and has done something that you just can't fathom nor understand. So you begin to look for what is around you. We've been there. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Moses says something far beyond wise, beyond his years right here. Moses says something right here that each and every Christian and every Christian leader needs to echo throughout all generations when he says, fear ye not, and stand still. So, this is a really bad example, but it's something that you can all relate to. You ever had your kid by the arm and going to whoop them and have to run in circles like this because they keep going around you? It's hard to do what you need to do when people's running, when people choose not to stand still, when people choose not to be willing and obedient. Things ain't always pleasant, but I need you to understand that we have to be willing and obedient for the Lord. But he says, fear ye not, and stand still. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. And the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? What does that even mean? Moses, where's your faith at right now there, buddy? We just had this conversation. I told you what was going to go on. I told you where I was going to lead you. I told you all the things that was going to happen. Why are you whining to me right now? Instead of stopping and trying to explain, I need you to be the leader that I have called you to be. I don't need you to stop and try to explain and help them understand their second guessing. I need you to lead. That's all Moses had to do, was to lead the people, encourage them to move forward, not to stop. Never stop on the Lord. You can't commit to something and then quit. You have to see it through. You have to keep moving no matter how tall the mountain or how deep the water. You have to chug through it. Lift up thy rod and stretch out thine hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel shall go on dry land through the midst of the sea. And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, that they will follow them. God says, I want you to part the waters. You're going to go through. I'm sending the Egyptians in there after you, and they will acknowledge me. They will see that I am Lord. They will see that I am that I am. They are going to confess that I am Lord on this side of the earth. They are going to do this. Now you can fast forward several thousands of years or so later, and you can understand that every man is going to do this too. All those that persecute the Christians, all those who come after you and saying that your God ain't true, at some point they will see God for exactly who He is, and they will say, there is a God, and I now fear Him. But at that point it can be too late. And the angel of God which went before the camp of Israel removed and went behind them, and the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them. That verse almost seems irrelevant until you also know that the children of Israel knew that an angel of God was with them. What did they have to fear? They had an angel of the Lord that was before them, that led them, that pillar of fire, the cloud, that protected them, that gave them light, that led the way. What did they have to fear? God was there. God gave us the promise. We hit this many times this morning, that He will never leave us nor forsake us. So why do we get afraid? Why do we worry? And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. There was a strong east wind that came, and the best I can understand by studying the situation, the sea split north and south. So the wind came this way, the waters parted this way and this way. I also want you to understand something. It says, all that night it made the sea and dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left hand. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and all his horsemen. So these people went in. I don't know how big the sea was. I honestly don't. But it was big enough, and there was enough people, that this was a kind of an all-night event. Because it started in the night, and we'll find out here in a few minutes, it kind of in the day here. But there was all these people that went through. It was wide enough that the Egyptians had began to get into the water, chasing after them, before the last Israelite got through on the other side. Imagine the fear and desperation, but imagine seeing that glory. Imagine seeing that deliverance, that act of God that was there. Could you imagine walking through a wall of water on each side with no glass, no nothing that is there? I went to Virginia Beach one time, and we went in the tunnel that went underneath the bay, and I kind of got a little bit freaked out right there because honestly, as you're going in, you can see water. You go in this big dark hole, and you go straight down. I'm not kidding. You know that you are going downhill. And there comes the point that you've went downhill long enough that if something happens, you're never going to know it. It gets very scary knowing that you are way down there that far. And then all of a sudden you turn and start coming up the other side. That's a good feeling. When you begin to see the daylight, that's a better feeling. But imagine walking through here, seeing this wall of water. I don't know how wide it was. I don't know if you could stand on this side with the amount of people that was going through there. I don't know if you could be on the wall that's closest to the left and begin to see all the way over to the wall that's on the right. I don't know what if I wasn't walking through there that I wouldn't kind of get gazing off into looking into the water and seeing if I couldn't see what all was in there. Now that's kind of where my mind would wander off into this. We get distracted in the deliverance of God. We can get distracted at the things that are around us and still not be able to give God the glory for it. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea, upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued, just as God said they would, and went in after them in the midst of the sea. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. Let's swap sides of this for just a minute. Let's fight for the other team for just a moment. If you were the Egyptians, would you have went in? I think I might have had to disobey that direct order. Because I do believe if I'm chasing a people that has already, that their God has already sent these plagues into my people, and all of a sudden I've got in here and there's this sea that is split and there's this wall of water, I kind of don't think I'm going to want to go in there. But they did. And it says that the Lord looked into the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. They acknowledged that their God was fighting for them. They acknowledged, again, that there was a God. They acknowledged that the great I Am is the great I Am. They acknowledged that they was wrong, and at this point, they regretted walking onto the water, into the dry land that was there. I couldn't imagine being on my chariot and my wheels falling off. Because I think by that time it was starting to get muddy. I think the ground was beginning to moisten up. I truly believe when it says the Lord looked upon them from the pillar that was there, I believe they could see the Almighty. I believe that there was something there that they could physically see that scared them to death. I believe there was something there that made them confess that the Lord is Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. I want you, Moses, to stretch your hand out, and I want you to conquer all the things that these people fear. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength. When the morning appeared, that the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And it goes on to say there that Israel began to see their bodies wash up on the shore, so they knew exactly what had happened to them, that had happened to the Egyptians. They knew at this point, not only did the Egyptians know that the Lord was the Lord, that the great I Am is the great I Am, that the Almighty truly is Almighty, but they also know that the Almighty defeated their fear. I want you to understand that as you read all of that, it makes a circle to know that even though you may think God has led you into a spot of entrapment where there's no way out, God does not need a window or a door to deliver you. He can take the water, He can separate it, He can dry it up, and He can provide a dry path for you. God doesn't need what we call what we view as possible. Because with God, all things are possible. I truly believe that there wouldn't have been an Egyptian there that would have really thought they could have crossed the Red Sea on dry land. But then God showed up. I believe sometimes we get into a spot, into a predicament that we have followed God and we're following with all our heart, and the devil gets in this ear and he begins to say, I want you to look. I want you to see what's around you. I want you to see the mountains. I want you to see the sea, and I want you to see the enemy that's coming. I want you to know that you're trapped. I want you to know that there's no way out. You might as well give in and go back to your bonds. You might as well give in and go back to what you knew. I want you to stop serving the Lord God Almighty. I don't want you to pursue what it is that God desires in your life. That's the devil talking. But fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. For God to move and for us to see it, sometimes we just need to sit and watch. Just sit and see how the events unfold. Sometimes we consider God to be slow. But that I know of, God don't have a watch. God's timing ain't our timing. We may feel that we've been encamped here for a lot longer than we deserve. Sometimes we might think 40 years is too long to wander aimlessly before God delivers His promise. But God don't work on your time. You may have to sit and wait for God's deliverance for quite some time. You go back and look at David. He had to wait quite some time to be the king that God told him he would be. He had to endure a whole lot of things that he didn't necessarily feel that he should have to endure in order to get there. But at the end of the day, he just needed to stand still and to watch and to see the deliverance of the Lord. God is not going to leave you. He will never lead you where He can't protect you. But the children of Israel walked upon the dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on the right hand and on their left hand. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians. And the people feared the Lord. I believe at this point, at least for a week or two, there was a point that they believed in the salvation of God. That they believed if we can get through this, we can get through anything. But they were no different than us. They didn't have a lot of patience. It didn't take long for the next trial to come up. It didn't take long for the murmuring and the complaining to begin again. It didn't take long for the disobedience again to happen. But they had that to rely upon. You can begin to look at the enemy approaching, but you can look back at the God's salvation. You can look back at what it is that He has done for you. You can look back at what He done for His people. He done exactly what He said He was going to do. The people feared the Lord and believed the Lord. Most importantly, they believed upon Him. They believed His promises. Friend, if you've been called into any portion, any kind, anything to do for God, whether it be in a mission field, whether it be teaching, whether it be as a deacon, whether it be in anything, shape, form, or fashion, first and foremost, God never told you it was going to be easy. But what He did tell you is that you can't do anything without Him. What He did tell you is that He's never going to leave you and He's never going to forsake you. And He also said that with Him all things are possible. So you can look and you can feel deserted and you can feel entrapped and you can feel the sense of panic. But just you watch. Stand still and wait upon the salvation of the Lord. They believed the Lord and His servant Moses.